With a 50-year career to date and still going strong, despite having suffered a stroke 2 years ago, abstract sculptor Bryan Kneale spoke to us at Pangolin London about how the Studio magazine helped inspire him in his early years on the Isle of Man, and about death by sculpture.
Well, there have been a few sculptors. Sarah's pieces have fallen on various people and murdered. Several deaths have occurred. None of mine, I might tell you, but it has occurred.
So how sturdy is this one here, pendulum?
It's all right, it's okay, providing you don't swing that out too far.
Is it intended to move?
Oh yeah, slightest movement, even the wind will blow it. It's funny, I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and he used to work for me, a chap called Ken Draper. He was saying he remembered me making that spiral, a huge great lump of steel, and heating it up and bending it, and twisting it.
Was this one of your first works?
It wasn't one of the first, but it was a fairly early one. It was made in about 1962, I think, something like that. Of course, I'm getting so ancient now, all these times seem far, far away. All my friends seem to be pegging out left, right, and center. My dear friend Bert Irving went the other day. Mind you, Bert was about 94 or something, but he kept on painting up to the end. It's much easier to keep going if you're a painter. Titian lived to a great age, but sculptors, some of them do, some of them don't. But I had this terrible stroke 2 years ago, and that really has knocked the stuffing out of me, really. So that's been a real problem. And sculpture is essentially a physical business, If you can instruct people to make it for you, but inevitably it's a hands-on job, always. Because, as far as I'm concerned anyway, some people don't, they just work entirely through, assistance and so on, from designs, maybe on computer or something like that. But I've always made everything myself, really, until nowadays when I have to have, and very big stuff, of course. I made an enormous piece a couple of years ago for Goodwood Sculpture Park, and that was in the forecourt of the RA, and that was 20 feet high and 30 feet long. Well, of course, that had to be made in China, so that's a different kettle of fish, really.
But you are still making work?
Well, at the moment, I'm mostly just drawing, actually, and I can make use of light materials and bits of cardboard and stuff like that, but ideas are still there. That's one of the frustrating things about it, really, is that because you know in your head how to make something. And I've talked to quite a few people, sculptors, who've been the same as me, and they sort of wake up in the early hours of the morning and think through the whole process of making something, and then they wake up and realize they can't do anything. That's a dream, but very realistic. But, it depends how you work. If you've got people who can help you, work with you, well, that's something else. And I have some very good friends who help me. And, of course, this gallery is set up by Runway Kingdom, who has a great foundry down in the West Country at Gloucester, and he can make anything, any size, no problem. And I think people like Damien Hirst and so on work with him, and I think he more or less says, well, what do you want? And they talk it over, and next thing, it's being created by a team of wonderful craftsmen. Absolutely amazing place. And now he has this beautiful gallery, and I'm very pleased to be showing in it.
The piece behind you, Nickerson, which you made for the Royal Academy summer exhibition last year, how did that get made?
Well, as a matter of fact, I found, I often work with a factory which makes, it's interesting enough, they started originally making boilers. Somehow or other, one of the director was an amateur painter. He was always very interested in what was going on in the arts. And as the demand for boilers fell away, he had the idea of using this great factory to make sculpture. And I remember him coming to see me years ago, a marvelous man called Barry Boileau. And that was the beginning anyway. And now he works for a lot of sculptors like, Bill Pye and Kapoor and various others, quite a lot of people. And they can tackle absolutely anything. And it's a great joy to be working with people of that quality, and because we speak the same language anyway, and I think that it certainly I've really enjoyed working with Barry, and I know Bill Pye is great water sculptures have really flourished only because he's been able to get the right people to work with him, that's half the battle. But I've always been rather a loner and made things by myself until, things change and you have the opportunity perhaps to make something which is totally impossible without lots of help. But yes, that's how I work now.
So have you always done drawings first, or do you just make?
I don't. No, not really. It's usually I start with pushing the metal around. But the thing is, the main thing about the way I've always approached working as a sculptor is that, it is perfectly possible to work in steel where you use preformed industrial product, RSJs, pieces of angle iron and so on. And but it is limiting because the language has to be limited to the material you're using. Well, I never have settled like that because I've always wanted to make my own shapes from scratch. And obviously in sort of some of these things I've used plate or spinnings, which are basically great pieces of steel which have been formed into domes and things like that. So you're not limited to flat pieces or something which is made for a particular shape for a particular reason. I would like the idea of being totally in charge of the shape as much as possible, rather than making a collage out of stuff which already exists, as shapes. It's just a way of thinking. It's different, and I just have work like that, and you have to find your own sort of voice as an artist anyway, whether it's in paint or bits of metal and so on. And if you start digging around, thinking where it's all come from, it's such a complicated process because you may have been heavily influenced by tripping over some bit of agricultural machinery in a field or something like that. I remember I come from the Isle of Man, and we have a lot of what they call thorthons, which are the remains of old farms, disused remains, because for some reason or other people have just left. And so you go into a farmyard, and you find various strange objects lying around, and you wonder what on earth they were. And they're probably something to do with, I don't know, a turnip chopper or something or other, and you think, what on earth's that? And so you build your imagination around that. For instance, they were much given to using rather beautiful cast iron cooking pots on 3 legs, very thin cast iron. And the broken bits of these are beautiful curved shapes. It's almost like the equivalent of finding a shell or something on the shore. And this wonderful, very thin, delicate, rusty metal has always had great interest to me, picking up something like that. And then then that leads on to other things which one might find. because it's all about discovering things really for yourself. So anyway, that's rather my process of where it all comes from in the first place. It's always rather difficult to tell because it comes from your own life, really, where you come from, all the things you've done in your life and things you've seen. And so, you see, I've never had much urge to work in a traditional modeling fashion or carving. It just isn't me, you know. I'm a bony sort of creature, and metal is much my sort of thing. And it's got such a history, its own history, and so one comes from wherever you come from. I mean, I was telling in the catalogue, this catalogue tells the story of how when I was a small boy, I must have been about 10 or something, I had whooping cough, and suddenly out in the hills in the island there was a tremendous explosion, and my father had a newspaper over there, so he had to go out and find out what had happened. And what it was a German bomber had been bombing Belfast and just jettisoned a bomb over the island. Of course, they never bombed the island because it was full of aliens, German, well, not prisoners, men and women were interned over there during the war. So in that way we escaped the bombs. Anyway, my dad went off and came back with a lump of shrapnel, which he gave me. And I thought it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I often think it's things like that which trigger you off, you know. In fact, my rage, I took it to school when I got better, and some swine stole it, and I never saw it again. But somebody was telling a story to the Manx papers one day, and they were saying, well, could you look in your garage, like looking for a stray cat or something? And if you find part of a bomb, let us know. That maybe it'll turn up, you never know, but it certainly put something in my head that and I've used that idea myself, exploding things with the help of the Navy on one occasion. There used to be a place where a lot of the artists used to gather in Fulham in a pub called Finch's, and one of the people who's come there was Augustus John's son, who was First Lord of the Admiralty, and he was Admiral Sir Caspar John. And so, but he was terribly nice, and he loved artists. He'd grown up with his father and all his friends, and he was talking to me and asked me what I was up to, and I said, you know, I'd really like to see what happened. I blew something up, and again, that relates to my shrapnel. So a few days later I got a phone call, and they said, we've got half a dozen Portuguese metallurgs down here waiting for you to blow things up on the bomb disposal area at Lydd. So off I went with a furniture van to pick up the bits, and we blew everything up in sight. And a bit too much, really. I got a bit unpopular for the amount of damage I was doing, but anyway, I brought it all back to London and started chopping it up and recutting it and finding strange shapes and so on. So that's the sort of way artists obviously find their way, and certainly. But actually, something that might interest you is that when I was growing up on the island during the war, we were pretty isolated, pretty cut off, and there were no art books that you could get hold of, very little. Later on, there were a few by the end of the war, but I discovered in the bowels of the public library huge bound volumes of the Studio magazine. Rummaging around down there, you'll find those marvelous pictures of Victorian sculpture, great magnificence. In fact, some of the stuff that's on in the Tate at the moment, Tate Britain, I think they've got a celebration of Victorian sculptors' craftsmanship. But a lot of those fantastic things were in the old studio magazine. I used to go down and get these volumes out and pore over them. But you get your idea, as I said, anywhere and any place. So there we are.